Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Anita Johnston, Ph.D., is a depth psychologist and author of Eating in the Light of the Moon: How Women Can Transform Their Relationships with Food Through Myth, Metaphor, and Storytelling, which has been published in 7 languages. She is the co-creator of the Light of the Moon Cafe, an online resource with interactive and self-study courses, and a supportive community for women around the world. She's a pioneer in the field of eating psychology for over 35 years. She is currently the founder and executive clinical director of Ipono Hawaii Eating Disorder Programs, which has a residential eating disorder treatment program on Maui. Dr. Johnston provides virtual individual consultations and conducts workshops internationally. She is best known for integrating metaphor and storytelling into her training as a clinical psychologist to explain the complex issues that underlie struggles with eating and body image. You can find her at dranitajohnston.com. dranitajohnston.com. Dr. Johnston, thank you so much for being with us this morning. It's delightful to see you again face to face.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I'm delighted that you were willing to share about your book, Eating in the Light of the Moon. I'm hoping you can tell us what led into this and what kind of a reaction you're getting from people about this book.
Well, I think what led into it was that for a while when I was working with clients struggling with disordered eating, and I would talk to them about some of these concepts, they would say, well, where can I read more about that? And I would realize, well, it hadn't been written. And so it started off as a little booklet for my clients. And then it just took on a life of its own, and it grew and grew. And so eventually when I had it published, and honestly, I was a little worried about it because it wasn't your traditional professional book. It was folktales and fairy tales from around the world that I used to explain some of the concepts. And I was not sure how well received it would be by my colleagues. And I was surprised that people really seemed to take to it, and treatment programs all over the country use it now. It's in 7 different languages, and it's been about 25 years. Well, no, longer. I wrote it in 1996, was the first published.
Well, and I was thinking about this interview and the various ways to try and get the message across. And I think what I settled on is if somebody told me, hey, look, you've got to find a problem with this book. You can't just say it's everybody should read it and you have to find a problem with it. I would be forced to come up with the only problem I would have with this book is that it's marketed towards people with eating disorders or women with eating disorders. And I'd rather have it just be out there for every woman who's ever struggled with finding her voice, tuning into her intuition, thriving in a patriarchal society. This is a magnificent work.
Oh. Well, it's interesting because that's what my sister said when I first had her read the manuscript. She said, Anita, this isn't a book about eating disorders. And I said, I know, but that's the portal that I had. That's what was available to me. And so I thought, okay, I'm going through that door.
Well, I have recommended this book to 7 or 8 bright women that I know that are none of them struggle with eating disorders. And I have to keep giving the disclaimer that I'm not trying to subtly suggest that they have an eating disorder that they need to work on, but that this book is just so full of wonderful stories and as you say, the stories, the fables, the metaphors, etc. And another thing I really like about it is that after each story, and they're not the usual, Jack and Jill went up the hill kind of quick things that we've all heard before. They're deep and they're rich, and some of them are long. And after each one, you do, I think, a wonderful job of explaining why you included it and what you're taking from it and what you hope other people can begin to look at as they're trying to get some meaning from the story.
Mhm. I've been fascinated. I love the old stories, right? The folk tales and the fairy tales that have been passed down for generation to generation, way before we even had written language. So, for example, a story that most people are kind of familiar with, Beauty and the Beast, they've decided it's 6,000 years old. 6,000 years old. So for me, I can't help but think, well, there's got to be value in it if people have taken the time and the interest to continue to share it. So that's my idea of a good time, is to look at these old stories and see if I can tease out the wisdom that's been embedded in them.
Well, and that there are layers of wisdom,
Layers.
right? So,
Mhm.
like three different things just rushed into my head at once, and I can't say them all at the same time and make any sense. So, there's a way that the obvious can teach, and
Mhm.
then a layer or two beyond the obvious. So, I think of Joseph Campbell, who used to talk about myth and say, if you ask people today what's the meaning of the word myth, they'll say, a false story, a fake story, a lie. Then that's simple. And he says, it's far more useful for us to think about myth as a story that conveys far more levels of depth and richness than you can if you're just talking about things at the conscious, logical, or the literal level.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, what got you going into myth instead of just the standard, well, let's talk at the conscious, logical, cognitive, behavioral level? What got you so interested in working with myth and story and fable?
I grew up in a multicultural household on the island of Guam. And so stories were told as ways of teaching. So I was familiar with that way of communicating, but it really wasn't until my children were little and they were going to Waldorf school. And the Waldorf school is where they used stories to teach things. And my kids would come home and they say, "Oh, today we learned about Prince division and Prince multiplication." And I went, "Oh, I would probably know my times tables now if I had learned it that way." And so I realized that, and this was very early on, they were getting these stories. They weren't even going to be doing that kind of math till for years later. So I realized, oh, okay, this is a way that I can explain to my clients the underlying issues around this struggle with food, because they think it's just about food. And I could see that it was more than that, but they couldn't see it. So I discovered if I use metaphor and story, then they could see it as well. And they could understand it. They can get all the layers, because what happens with the metaphor, which is the language of story, according to Carl Jung, that it impacts us on three different levels. One is the mental, the other is the emotional. There's usually a feeling embedded in it. And then the third is the imaginative level. And the imaginative level, that's where the transforming experience occurs through the use of imagination. But what he said is that it hits the psyche at these three levels simultaneously. So because of that, change can be more immediate. And so I was working with a lot of folks that were looking for change and they were really frustrated. And so finding a way that we could shift it was really pretty powerful.
Yeah, it is indeed. And years ago, when I was trying to develop some skills as a public speaker, I paid for a course with a gentleman who talked about how every speech you give should be a series of stories. And when he's trying to help somebody and they've got this great expertise and they're going out there to be on the speaker circuit with all of their content and their expertise, and he starts working with them, he has a hard time getting them to understand that if they can't put it in a story, they can have all the best expertise in the world and it's just going to bounce off the listeners like the rain bounces off your car when you're driving in a storm. And so he tells stories. He was working with a particular young guy who was just not convinced. And he said, well, they were traveling through an airport together. And somebody recognized the very popular older public speaker and came up to him and said, oh my God, you're so-and-so, and this is great. He said, yeah. So I saw you back in, 30 years ago at such and such. Oh yeah, that's great. And he says, now, remember that story you told about the piano? And the speaker said, oh yes, absolutely. And then he said to him, that was a great story. I tell that story. He said, and do you remember what the story was about? And the guy says, I don't know the message, but man, it's a great story, great punchline. I tell it all the time. So he turned to his young associate and said, you see, this is the deal. They remember the stories. They get in.
Right.
And as you say, they have these at least the 3 layers of impact.
And not only that, but we are story creatures, right? So our brains have been developed to understand story. So, and it's interesting when they do the studies. Of course, they can do all kinds of things now with the technology, but the stories don't come in through this part of our brain. They come in at a deeper part of our brain, and then we start to make a little bit of sense out of them. So essentially, our brains over hundreds of thousands of years have been developed with a kind of, they call it a story architecture in the brain itself. So you're really, when you're telling a story, you are tapping into something that's already there. It's lying in wait.
Yeah, the hard wiring's in there, right?
It's there.
It's almost, it's not almost, it's probably related to the speech centers of the brain they're ready to develop the speech. And we don't come out speaking, but we're just really primed to learn it. So is there a way for you to share a story about someone you've worked with who's been captured, helped, released by a particular story or metaphor that either one that you've included in the book or others that you know?
Yeah, there's one that is my favorite because I still get letters and emails from people all over the world that say, this one metaphor transformed my understanding of the struggle with disordered eating. And so I went, okay, so now that's my favorite. So I'm happy to share that here and might have an impact on someone that's listening. So we always begin with our superpower, which is our imagination. Remember, that's the level that Jung talked about. So imagine you're on the banks of a raging river. It's pouring down rain, and you slip and you fall in and you're drowning. You're getting pulled down through the rapids. And along comes a big log and you grab on. And the log saves your life. It keeps your head above water when surely you would have gone down. And eventually it carries you to the place in the river where the water is calm. And from there you see the riverbank, but you can't get there because you're holding onto the log. So the irony is the very thing that saved your life is now getting in the way of you getting where you want to go in life. To make it more complicated, there's always someone on the riverbank yelling, let go of the log, let go of the log. And you feel like an absolute idiot because you can't let go of the log. Well, the way I see it is letting go of that log may not be the best thing to do initially. Because what happens if you let go of the log, start to swim to shore, get halfway there and realize, oh, I don't have the strength to make it. That means you don't have the strength to make it back to the log either, and you're really sunk. So I believe that we have a wise part of ourselves that will not let us let go of anything until we're ready. So what do you do instead? Well, let go of the log and try floating. And as soon as you start to sink, you grab back on. And then you let go of the log and you try treading water. And when you get tired, you grab back on. Then you let go of the log and you swim around it once, grab back on, twice, grab back on, 10 times, 100 times, 200 times, whatever it takes for you to have the strength and confidence to swim to shore. Then you let go of the log. So that's a metaphor I would use to explain a lot of things about the struggle with disordered eating, for example. The number one is that there's a reason, a very good reason, you're doing whatever it is you're doing with food. And so it would behoove you to find out what that is. What is it doing? Everyone knows what it's doing to you, but what is it doing for you? And so that's, again, with this metaphor, I'm not even saying anything about food, but I'm describing a process that people can relate to. We all know the experience of drowning, and that metaphorically holds more than just being in the water, right? I could say, I have a lot of paperwork to do, or I could say I'm drowning in paperwork. It conveys something very, very different. So with this metaphor, I'm giving the idea that there's a reason, a good reason, which helps to take away some of the shame that because that gets in the way of the recovery journey. And I'm also introducing the idea that there are skills you have to learn. And so again, I'm not saying what they are because they're different for different people. But a metaphor like this allows an individual to really decide what aspects fit for them.
And it is applicable in my mind to every addictive process, to
Yes.
every log that we
Yes.
might have used. And it's so much a part of why I refer this book to different people, because in that favorite metaphor of yours, that favorite story, when I beat myself up because I can't let go of the log or because I'm not strong enough yet to swim to shore, it's sapping my energy that I could be using to develop the skills, whatever it is, the swimming strength or the other skills needed to get where I want to go.
Mhm.
And when I have the problem of beating myself up and then grabbing the log and then beating myself up because I grabbed the log without realizing that the beating myself up is the thing that's literally making me need the log more, right? It's
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
we talk to people about this. I talk to people about this in terms of guilt, and they think guilt is so important because you need your guilt to. And I try to point out to people, if you've ever been around 12-step groups, you see a lot of people who have a relapse and they have a lot of guilt about their relapse. And I encourage you to go and ask them, is this your first relapse? Oh, no, no. Have you had guilt the last time you had a relapse? Oh, yeah, heavy guilt. Did you have any relapses before that? Oh, yeah, I've had several. Did you have guilt with any of those? Oh, yeah. Well, you start to see the pattern. If there's guilt after every relapse and the relapses keep happening, maybe guilt isn't so productive to preventing relapses. Now, I'm not immediately assuming there's a cause and effect relationship between guilt and the relapse, but it's worth exploring.
Yeah, it's so worth exploring. For me, a lot of my work is trying to move the judgment aside because the judgment slams the door shut to communication, right? So if you
Exactly.
said to a little kid, "Why do you do that?" You're not going to get an honest answer, right? They're going to tell you whatever it is they think you want to hear. But if you ask that exact same question without the judgment, if you say, "Oh, why did you do that?" The answer you get may amaze you. And so it is with ourselves. So whenever there's that judgment, and the answers are inside each and every one of us. And so if you're trying to access those answers, you got to move the judgment to the side because you're just going to get a defense.
Well, and you said a phrase earlier that really resonates with me, and you said something to the effect of, let's figure out what it's doing for you.
Yeah.
We can understand how overeating might be doing something to you, or drinking excessively might be causing these problems and doing things to you. And yet everybody can see those, and there'll be a whole bunch of people that want to point that out to me. And yet, if I can't figure out what it's doing for me, then I can't find a way to get that need met in another, perhaps more productive or less destructive way. And that's such a useful approach to helping people, at least as I've discovered. And it's the core of the coherence therapy approach. Any good non-pathologizing approach understands, we do things for reasons.
Yeah.
And they may not be here conscious, logical, right in front of our mind, and yet they're still there. And every time they're activated, there's at least a pull in that direction.
Yeah, if you're wanting to put the addiction or the obsession or whatever the thing is out of a job, you have to find out what that job is, right? You can't just say, you're fired. Fired from what?
Yeah, that's good. I haven't heard that put that way before. So I want to put this substance, this behavior, this addiction out of a job. What's its job?
Exactly, right?
What's it been doing for me that I now have to go hire some other people to do, or I have to pick
or
up
develop the
slack,
faculty to do it in another
do it myself, right? Exactly. Well, so is there another second favorite story that you could share?
Yeah, so this isn't so much of a story, but it's a framework that I use metaphor for understanding the struggle with eating. And so I say, imagine you have two tanks, and we're going to just call them something fancy like tank A and tank B. And tank A is the tank you fill when you need physical nourishment, and you fill it with food. Tank B is the tank you fill when you need non-physical nourishment, attention, affection, appreciation, acknowledgement, meditation, prayer, and so on. But we don't know this. We think we have just one tank. So before we know it, either tank A is full and overflowing, but we're still hungry, or we don't even want to put anything in tank A because it seems like the bottomless pit. So what we have to do is we have to tease the two tanks apart. And because they require different kinds of food, we're talking about different kinds of hunger, and people often get it all scrambled up. So to fill tank A, you have to learn interoceptive awareness, and that's basically your hunger and satiety signals, right? Learning exactly what those sensations are that tell you when you're hungry and what the sensations are that tell you when you're full. Now, unfortunately, we live in a culture that's so steeped in diet mentality, most people don't even know that. They have to be a member of the Clean Plate Club, or they eat because they were good, or they don't eat because they weren't good, or there's all this stuff tangled up. So learning how to read the body signals is a first step. But for the purposes of this conversation, let's imagine that someone knows their hunger and satiety signals, and they're reaching for the pizza, and they know to check in, and there's not a hunger signal in sight, but they still want to eat that pizza. Well, that's when you've tumbled down Alice in Wonderland's rabbit hole, and you've landed smack dab in tank B. Because in tank B, pizza is not pizza. Food isn't food. What is it? It's a concrete physical symbol of another kind of hunger that you're experiencing and may not even know about. So this is when in the absence of your body talking to you, you're in the world of metaphor, and you have to really look at it symbolically. Like you could have 1,000 American flags. Are you more free? No, it's just the symbol of freedom. So the food is actually talking to you, but it's talking to you in symbolism and metaphor. It's coded, and you have to crack the code. So I have a simple way of starting. We're all totally different, but this is just to get people to start thinking in these terms. So for example, sweet foods, if maybe it is a sweet food you're wanting to eat and you're not hungry, to start to take a look at, okay, where in my life is there not enough sweetness? Or where do I feel like I'm not sweet enough? Because we use that word sweet for things other than food. Oh, what a sweetheart. Or that was a sweet thing to do. Or where's the sweet spot, right? So it's talking to us, but we have to really go through those layers. Crunchy, salty foods are usually connected to unexpressed anger and frustration. Warm foods like soups and stews are often connected to a craving of emotional warmth. Spicy foods, and again, this is either a craving of or a resistance to, and you are hungry. Spicy foods typically have to do with excitement, stimulation, and change. And chocolate, we know this from Valentine's Day. Romance, love, sensuality, and sexuality. So when you can start to look at the food through that lens, a whole world opens up of understanding.
Beautiful. If you can get yourself, or if you can find a book like yours, Eating in the Light of the Moon, to start helping you explore that. And you
Mhm.
talk about it in the book, just as you were talking about it just now to us, and beautifully. I mean, it's the kind of book that I know I will reread, so that it's going to help me bring up those associations
Mhm.
and help other people question for themselves, what is it I might be trying to accomplish when I'm either resisting this food or craving this food, when
Mhm.
it's not a hunger-based fulfillment.
Actually, I have, and I can give this link to you. You can put it in the show notes, but I have a free downloadable PDF that someone can get at lightofthemooncafe.com/my gift. And it's how to walk. You can take a food and it shows you how to start to decode that. So that's something if your
Excellent.
listeners
Thank
are
you.
interested in. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm sure that I will take advantage of that, and that several of the people I work with will be grateful to have that.
Mhm.
Your sister said, and
Mhm.
I said, this is a wonderful book for all kinds of women, whether they have a struggle with an addiction or an eating disorder or not. When you hear that comment, what gets stirred up for you?
Well, what it has stirred up is a new book for me to write. So that I'm in the process of writing that is not about eating. It's really more about this imbalance that all of us struggle with because of the nature of the culture we live in between what Jungians call the masculine and feminine principles and how to find that balance, because that's what I saw getting played out with food, but also in so many other areas of our lives. So I'm looking at the old stories and trying to find, okay, where's the wisdom embedded in these stories that can help us today find that balance? Because I believe because the feminine principle had to go underground for thousands of years, they tucked some of this information away into the stories.
What are some of the sources you use? There were stories, obviously, in your book that I'd never encountered before or anything like them before. So, what are some of the sources you use? Like what the big person that comes to my mind, I kind of cut my teeth on this, was the Joseph Campbell work with his myths of the gods and masks of the gods, etc. What other sources do you use to get your stories?
I'm always on the hunt. So, of course, there's the Brothers Grimm's, who, by the way, I didn't know this about them. Everyone knows Grimm's fairy tales, but these two guys, these were two really young guys. And they traveled around the towns and cities and countrysides talking to the women, because the women were the keepers of the stories, and collecting them. And then they published them. But these aren't their stories. These are stories that have been passed down for eons. So I go to them because there's a lot of them and they're old. Hans Christian Andersen, because I grew up with some of those stories. But I'm also interested in stories from a different cultures from the time I was little. I grew up with stories from Micronesia. And so when I hear a story or I read a story, if it grabs me, then I just have to stay with it. And so I'm always on the hunt, and I go through lots and lots of books and lots of stories looking for one that I feel in my body, that I don't even know what I'm feeling, but there's something there. I know there's something there. I can feel it.
As you talk,
Mhm.
I'm remembering when I was in high school or soon after high school, somebody I came across it. Well, I think it was one of my best friends introduced me to this. The book was called Black Elk Speaks. Are you familiar
Oh,
with that?
I am.
Is that a Native American anthology?
I'm not sure. I remember the title of the book. I probably even have it in my library because my background is indigenous from Guam, and so I'm always drawn to indigenous writings.
So if that's not the one, there's another book that was a Native American anthology. That might be a wonderful source for you for some
Hmm.
other stories. I remember reading it, and there were several of the stories that I think there's only one that I remember and I can tell all the way through, but several others I've got pieces of.
Hmm.
Um, so I'll send that to you if I discover
Oh,
what that
great.
Native
That'd be
American
great.
anthology was.
Hmm.
So I'm conscious of the time here. I have a hard stop before too long, and I want to get centered and ask you, what's an aspect of your work that we haven't even touched on yet that you want to make sure we talk about?
I happen to believe that those who struggle with disordered eating or other forms of addictions or are the people the world has been waiting for. And the reason I say this is that in my experience, I have found them to be very emotionally sensitive and highly intuitive. But we live in a culture that doesn't celebrate that and doesn't know what to do with that, and often can be very dismissive of those qualities. And so I've seen that that's at the root for a lot of people of their struggle is an attempt to dim their light, to diminish this capacity to see the world in a much broader sense. And so those folks who struggle and get on the recovery path are the people the world has been waiting for, because what we need more than anything is more empathy and compassion. Our world would be in a lot better shape if more of our world leaders were strong in these areas. And so I feel really, this is why I do the work I do. I feel like, okay, this is my contribution, is to help these folks that have already this in their nature to use it to better the world. And because I've been doing this for so long, I get to see that happen all the time.
The phrase that comes up for me is finding meaning, maybe even creating meaning. Maybe the meaning doesn't exist in an absolute sense. Maybe there's quote no quote reason why this happened to me, and yet I can make it meaningful to me. I can have the challenges that I overcome or I have to wrestle with be the source of how I develop new skills or strength or endurance. And if we would help people, and that's what I think most of us in therapy are focused on, if they're not just focused on symptom suppression, we're focused on trying to help people grow through their trials and their challenges. And that's just a wonderful focus. I'm glad you said it that way. The other thing that came to me as you were talking is the idea of integrating that emotional, intuitive part of ourselves, that sensitivity, with the kind of strict, what we call logical, intellectual capacity, because it's those people who can blend those that I think are really our pioneers in life.
That's the balance between, you can call it yin yang, masculine, feminine, head, heart. I mean, that's really what I think is you're right. They have the capacity for that. The metaphor that I like to use is one of your life being a three-act play. So, act one, the stage has been set, the script has been written, the characters have been cast, and you don't have any say. These are your parents. Here's your ethnicity. Here's the part of the world you're going to be born in. Here's your socioeconomic group. This is your fate. It's delivered up. Act two, there's still the script has been written, but some characters come and go. There's a little room for ad libbing, but still, you don't have a whole lot of say. Here's your car accident. Here's your illness. There's still a lot of fate involved in Act two. Act three, that one's yours. You get to decide, okay, is my story going to be a tragedy? Her life sucked when she was born and it sucked when she died. Or is it going to be a Horatio Alger rags to riches? Or is it a tale of ironies? Who would have thought that out of this could have come? Or is it going to be an inspirational tale? Oh my gosh, if he could do that, given the few resources he had, well, then maybe I can do that. So we get to decide our story. And that's where we do have what is our destiny. The destiny has some will in it, but in order to live your destiny, this is what all the stories tell us, you must first face your fate. So bemoaning why this happened and that's getting in the way of you writing Act 3.
Yeah, David Kessler wrote a book, Finding Meaning, the Sixth Stage of Grief, which is, that's your Act 3, right? So
Yeah, yeah. My very first teacher in school, I did not know who he was Viktor Frankl. And once I was able to really tune in, because spoke with a thick accent for me that I'd never heard before. And that was it. I was hooked. I mean, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, as a result of his experiences in the Nazi prison camp in World War II. And he said, you can be stripped of everything you've ever held dear. And he did. He lost his parents, he lost his wife, he lost his friends. But he said, there's one thing that can never, ever, ever be taken away from you, and that is the meaning you give to your experience. And therein lies your freedom. Ever since then, that sort of put me on this path to find, well, what is the meaning?
yeah, his book has touched so many lives.
Mm.
3 people I've interviewed in the past year going through very difficult circumstances. Each of them had the gift of getting his book while they were imprisoned for
Yeah.
something they didn't do, and used it as the log, as the life raft
Mm-hmm.
to maintain their sanity, to maintain their sense of self in at least some semblance of what they would want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was one of the more powerful books I read in college that
Mm-hmm.
was a life blessing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you would get centered, take a breath, and leave us with what would you like to close out with that you'd like our listeners to have as your final statement or overview?
I think what I would like people to understand about recovery, whatever that is for them, is that recovery is authenticity. And we're each as unique as our thumbprint. And so we come with gifts and challenges, but real recovery is when you claim all of that.
Authenticity.
Mhm,
Yeah, you say that, and I hear deep honesty. And
mhm.
several of the people that have really, their work and writing has touched me are the ones who talk about how difficult it can be
Yeah.
to just be more fundamentally, radically honest with myself.
Mhm,
And then, of course, with others.
mhm, mhm.
So I applaud you for this book. It's a wonderful addition to my toolkit with people. Is there any idea about how long before the next book is out?
Well, I started it during COVID because I was, had to entertain myself, right? And so we're getting close. We're getting close to the end. I've been doing another book on exercise resistance with a colleague of mine using the same kind of format, and that's probably closer to the finish line than the book that I'm currently writing by myself. But I would like for it to be ready next year. It's not too far away.
Yeah, yeah. So what's the website again where people can contact you or learn more about your work?
Well, you can reach me at dranitajohnston.com. And if you're interested in eating issues, it's the lightofthemooncafe.com.
And the Light of the Moon Cafe.com slash, what was that offer? The free gift?
Slash my gift.
My
And
gift.
there's a downloadable PDF.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being willing to take time to share with us, and congratulations on a fabulous work, and I look forward to reading the next book.
Thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Anita Johnston, Ph.D., is a depth psychologist and author of Eating in the Light of the Moon: How Women Can Transform Their Relationships with Food Through Myth, Metaphor, and Storytelling, which has been published in 7 languages. She is the co-creator of the Light of the Moon Cafe, an online resource with interactive and self-study courses and a supportive community for women around the world. She's a pioneer in the field of eating psychology for over 35 years. She is currently the founder and executive clinical director of Ipono Hawaii Eating Disorder Programs, which has a residential eating disorder treatment program on Maui. Dr. Johnston provides virtual individual consultations and conducts workshops internationally. She is best known for integrating metaphor and storytelling into her training as a clinical psychologist to explain the complex issues that underlie struggles with eating and body image. You can find her at dranitajohnston.com. DranitaJohnston.com.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.